is our guest speaker. Everybody knows Ruth. She's been around for a long time. She's a professional historian with special expertise in mining history, local and organisational history, and the history of railways. I don't think there's a book that gets published in this place without an article in it by Ruth. She has served in a long career in the Queensland Public Service, Queensland State Archives, the Crown Law Office, the Parliamentary Library, and the Department of Mines and Energy, with service in the area of native title. Her knowledge of native title is quite extraordinary. She was the recipient of the Kerr Medal in 1992, was it?
2013.
2013. First female president of this society, which is quite an extraordinary effort. All males up to that point in time from 1913 until she was president in 1992 to 1995. Currently honorary secretary, and she's been honorary secretary for a long, long time, and library manager of the society. Yesterday, her position as adjunct professor in history at the University of Queensland was renewed. So a very distinguished lady, OAM, and so we're extremely honoured to have her give this lecture today on Peter Moffat and his tragic marriage. Probably not the first person to have a tragic marriage, but he certainly had one by the sounds of things, Ruth. Her lecture is about the Scottish migrant miners and their relatives to Brisbane and to North Queensland, Irvinebank, Montbalbion, west of Cairns. Peter Moffat was a mining engineer and John Moffat a mine owner and manager. John Moffat became a millionaire through the Montbalbion investment, and Peter Moffat had a huge debt. Not uncommon, one makes the money and one has the debt. This lecture will outline their personal relationships with Jane Very, near love. I had loves in my family, so we might be related there, Ruth, or we may be related to these people. And Margaret Lyndale, that's Jane and Peter's daughter. So thank you, Ruth. You want this one or that one?
Is this on?
Yep.
Yes. Right. I might use it when I go over there. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I appreciate everybody coming, including 4 people from the Adam family that I wrote an article on and presented at Newstead House in 1976, and it was published. He was a school teacher in these North Queensland mining areas as well as southern Queensland. My story today that I tell to northerners such as Peter and Lorraine who have come, and all of you. My story is about 2 men and 3 women, and a very successful sale of silver mining and tin mining shares. These 2 people is John Moffat in 1882, a photograph taken in Glasgow where he came from, and Jane Very, the photograph taken in 1882. I do not have a photograph of Peter Moffat. I do have a photograph of his tombstone in the Irvinebank cemetery. I usually visit Irvinebank once a year and place flowers on the grave, as do other tourists who know the history. Peter Moffat was born in Robertson Street, Glasgow on the 7th of September 1859. He died at age 30. So I'll show you some significant photographs and maps to set the context. This is the North Queensland hinterland, a vast mining area of the tablelands and beyond as far as Chillago and Cardross. And John Moffat, whom you saw the photograph of, became the mining magnate of that region. And he had other investments in Australia as well. This is a really illustrative map of what I'll speak about today. Can you, right. This is Mont Albion. Irvinebank is 6 miles this way. This is Gibbs Creek. If you have my book, you'll see all detail of this. This is Mont Albion, a silver mining town and investment. What I want you to look at and keep in your mind is 3 things. Here's the town, there's the creek. The school was here and there were hotels, etc. Here are the mines up on a high mountain. There is a Lady Jane mine. Down here are the ruins of the smelter. Here is the road from the mines down to the smelter. Here's a map drawn in the 1890s of Mount Albion Hill and the mines, or silver mines. Note the Lady Jane mine and the Lady Jane shaft. Here is the town, which you'll see better, where the school reserve was and the post office and the police station and the creek to the north. Here is the Mont Albion, well, it was called the Mount Albion Silver Smelter, which Peter Moffat, as a mining engineer, did the planning of the construction and its management and became the manager of the smelter. This was from, the construction was 1885-86. The smelters were blown in 86 and he managed it. At the top are the buildings of the town, and far beyond, up on the hill, are the mines. My late husband John and I climbed that hill several times to see the mines. This building is the oldest high-standing house in North Queensland. It was built in 1884-85, occupied in 86, and is still there and is the museum of the local town, Irvinebank. The name of the house is Loudon House with 2 U's, named after the area in Ayrshire where John Moffat came from. This house features in my talk. This is John Moffat and his wife Margaret, née Lyndale, in 1904, taken in Irvinebank. John Moffat was born in 1841. Came to Queensland in 1862, worked in a shop just behind us this way in George Harris and Co.'s shop, built a shop with his relative Robert Love, who'd come in 1863 on the Cairngorm and brought his daughter Jane, who became Jane Barry. John Moffat knew Jane from childhood. Margaret Lyndale was the housekeeper in Loudon House for the managers and John Moffat, and they married in 1890. Peter Moffat, as I said, I do not have a photograph, and I've searched in Australia and Scotland extensively. I'll keep going. He was born in 1859. He married a divorcee, Jane Barry, who was 4 years older than him, in May 1887, here in a home in Norfolk Road, South Brisbane. Jane died in London at Fulham during childbirth of their baby daughter, whom they named Jane Love Moffat. Peter died 15 months later at Irvinebank on the 26th of May, 1889. Jane was the daughter of Robert Love, who was in partnership with John Moffat when he had a shop in South Brisbane where QPAC is, and then they went to Stanthorpe, had a shop there, 1872 to 76. Jane had married James Barry, a Scotsman, on the 11th of June 1873 in Ipswich. They had 4 children. They lived in Brisbane mostly. 3 children died of children's infectious diseases. James turned out to be an adulterer who also committed domestic violence. They separated, and James went to the New England tablelands to work. Jane applied for divorce in the New South Wales Supreme Court in 1882. The court proceedings were funded by John Moffat of Irvinebank, who had known her since childhood. The photograph of Jane is a copy of one in the divorce file of the Supreme Court of New South Wales. Now I'll tell you the story of the three people in more detail. Peter Moffat was much more ambitious, publicly so, than John. He expected to realise handsomely from the sale of the Mount Albion silver mining shares. The 1880s were a boom period, and that was strongly likely. He really wanted social status. The Mount Albion smelter. I said that John Moffat had known Jane from Glasgow. He clearly was very interested in their future together. He decided after Jane's divorce to invite her to Irvinebank for a holiday. He even hoped that she might ride with him out to his new mines. He fully intended to look after her. He wanted a good piano to provide entertainment for visitors, and she was a pianist. So he ordered one, and it bumped its way up over the tablelands in the wet season of 1887. Jane was uncertain of John's purpose, but he wrote to his parents, "My desire in this matter, as in most others in which I have influenced, is simply to further, as far as I may, your benefit and happiness." Remember only that I am one among the others, but with more of a right and need to show you your tenderest care because of the longest acquaintance and intimate association. All else trust to the guidance of Providence, who alone can see through the tangledness of our lives. Moffat was a very religious person. Meanwhile, Margaret Lindale, the housekeeper, and another lady, Mrs. Gillen, cheerfully arranged all sorts of impromptu social evenings in Loudon House. So, while John Moffat was worrying, as he did, about his mining investments, the tin mines, his manager's loneliness in the distance on those fields, Peter Moffat was upstairs in Loudon House, dancing with the women. John Moffat was the provider, Peter was the socialite. At 46, John Moffat cultivated his role as the patriarch of the North Queensland mining industry, and he hoped for a fine future with Jane Barry. He fervently hoped that they would marry. John proposed to Jane, Jane, it troubles me that we should have drifted into one of the most important steps of our lives upon the spur of the moment, arising out of our mutual relationships. But yet there are misunderstandings. Save that for all the last 6 months sojourn together, we've seemed to know one another only at a distance. There's scarcely been an effort to realise one another's mental and moral states or to enter into spiritual contact. Moffat was a Swedenborgian, not a Presbyterian or the four main denominations. He was active in the Swedenborgian, which is a much more spiritual church in Glasgow, and he supported the Swedenborgians here in Brisbane financially. So he continued in his letter to Jane, we must needs fall into the position of being mutually bound without giving ourselves mentally and spiritually into closer intimacy. Neither felt they could publicise the engagement. Jane was already pregnant with Peter Moffat's baby, and her northern holiday ended abruptly. John Moffat was devastated on hearing the news. He asked Jane to agree to put aside the engagement. Jane, do not let yourself feel hurt or disappointed about my request, nor think ungenerously of my apparent faithlessness. We must learn to love each other in the future. John Moffat still offered to pay Jane a living allowance so that she need not work, and he promised to visit her in Brisbane. Peter and Jane came to Brisbane to marry, and they departed for Scotland on a honeymoon and to see their family. Naturally, John Moffat vented his frustration with his business managers. He had a private company of 3 shareholders only, John Moffat, George Young, and John Reid of Tenterfield, New South Wales. He continued to worry extensively about financial difficulties. The North is a very fine place for making money, but a very poor one for keeping it. We seem to have good properties, and men mostly have good wages, but we all seem hardly ever to get out of poverty. Some of us are Scottish. however, and we are ready to forget the difficulties and disappointments of the past. We look forward to the future, and we are still in good hopes of making Irvinebank and other properties here all we had hoped for them. But nothing is assured, and I must acknowledge to be getting more and more tired of the continual strain. That was in 1887. It took many months for the Mount Albion Silver Mining Smelting Company shares to be put on the London Stock Exchange, and that is what they sought to make their handsome profit from. Before the success of his sale of his Mount Albion shares came the news of the death in childbirth of Jane Varry in February 1888. Peter Moffat was devastated. John Moffat hoped he might come back to Australia and continue to operate the Mount Albion smelters. However, Peter's family had been dogged by very bad luck. His father was a drunkard who was living with Peter's epileptic sister before his death, and his mother was extremely possessive of Peter, her successful colonial son. As he had boasted of his Mount Albion shares, his mother extracted from him a bond of £5,000 to be paid at Easter in 1889. Peter Moffat took the baby to Scotland and gave his baby to his sister Elizabeth Bannatyne Moffat, then living in Glasgow, and she then moved to Ayrshire. The laws of adoption, as we understand them today, were not in operation in the late 19th century, so families looked after new babies. Now, as I said, John Moffat hoped that Peter would return and run the smelters very well. However, on return to North Queensland, Peter naturally was really depressed about the loss of his wife and his baby, and his mother died soon after. Peter proved quite ineffectual in managing Mount Albion enterprise, and so John Moffat had to promote other workers at Mont Albion to manage it. Peter Moffat lived in a house in Irvinebank with two other people, Charles Alexander and William Seaman, in a decent house, and rode out to Mont Albion every day. However, he had also suffered rheumatic fever and was very restless but very quiet, even to the point of weeping in conversation with William Waddell, a manager at Mont Albion, about the delay in the listing of the Mont Albion shares on the London stock market. So things drifted. The outcome of this was that Peter Moffat died in Irvinebank in his house by suicide by drinking potassium cyanide. He had a huge debt which he couldn't pay to his family. The shares were still not listed, so the financial bond was in enormous difficulty. The inquest file exists, been preserved in the inquest series at Queensland State Archives. He did write a note, and even this week when I read it, having understood everything else that had happened to the Moffat family, I was very saddened. He wrote, quote, "My troubles are being too much for my brain. May God forgive those who have helped to add to them." The Irvinebank people reported it to the police magistrate. An inquiry was held immediately. There was obviously no suspicious circumstances, and Peter was buried the next day. Anna, this is not working. Because the Irvinebank people had a large funeral for Peter and paid for the erection of this tombstone entitled, "In Affectionate Remembrance of Peter Moffat, who departed this life 26th of May 1889, aged 30 years. 'Tis the angel's faith and ours that death is but a passing of the soul from life to higher life." Now, Peter Moffat died when John Moffat had just left Irvinebank to go south to Tenterfield to see his business partner, John Reed. Peter died when John Moffat was away. So John did not attend the funeral. Irvinebank people, and no doubt John, paid for the funeral and the tombstone. Now, the really positive outcome is this: what happened to Jane Love Moffat, the baby. I found in John Moffat's letters, he remarked to his parents that Elizabeth, Peter's sister, would take the baby to South Africa, where she was intending to live on marrying an architect there. Elizabeth Bannatyne Moffat married William Leck in Durban on the 20th of September 1889. Jane Love Moffat retained her parents' surname. The Lecks lived in Johannesburg, where William Leck was a highly regarded architect, so Jane would have been educated there. William Leck died suddenly on the 10th of August 1907 in Durban, and his widow continued to live in South Africa. Jane Love Moffat married Edward Herbert Clifford, a mining engineer at St Mary's Church of England in Johannesburg on the 24th of June 1911. Jane was 23 and gave her address as 41 9 Street, Johannesburg, which is a suburb not far from the cathedral. Elizabeth Bannatyne Leck, her adoptive mother, was a witness at the wedding. Edward Clifford gave his address as the Rand Club, a very elite club for businessmen and mining company owners in Johannesburg. He and his parents were English from Lincolnshire. Edward was 12 years older than Jane when they married. Edward and Jane travelled the world in connection with Edward's mining career. In 1941, Edward was president of the Institution of Mining and Metallurgy in Britain. He was very involved with companies in the United States and Canada. In World War II, he was based in Britain in intelligence work. He was a member of the Committee for Non-Ferrous Metallic Ores to the Ministry of Supply of Britain. He died suddenly in northwest Surrey in December 1943. Jane stayed in Britain for the remainder of World War II and went back to Cape Town, South Africa, in November 1947 on the ship City of Hull. I have not been able to find an address for her in South Africa thereafter, or her date of death, or a grave site. I don't think that's altogether put it another way. I don't think that the reason for that could be described as my inability to do research. as I have done very extensive research endeavours in South Africa, but research in cultural institutions in that country is currently challenging, and access to records is problematic. I believe that Jane never visited Australia. North Queensland researchers have hoped to locate a fairy tale visit, but without success. So I conclude with both the story of challenge and sadness, and a great positiveness. Jane the baby really had a very stimulating and enjoyable life, I think, from what I've found from where she travelled. And living in South Africa at those times would, within the context of the mining industry, would have been a very happy and comfortable life. Her father's difficulties in the relationships with his parents and siblings, and the date upon which the Mount Albion shares came onto the London Stock Exchange, was to Peter's disadvantage. If he had not had the bond to his mother and siblings, his life would have been better. Meanwhile, in contrast, when the shares did go onto the stock market, John Moffat became the millionaire, and his cousin had already died in sadness. But his daughter, I think, had a wonderful life. Thank you.
Ruth, you'll take questions, won't you?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ruth. That was excellent.